We'll go ahead and get started. It is noon-ish. My name is Lauren, and I'm so incredibly pleased that you guys are here today. It is my joy to introduce our speaker today. But before we jump into that, I do have a few housekeeping pieces. If you have your cell phone out, fantastic. If you don't, I encourage you to bring it out, hit the little button at the top, or the button on the side, and turn your volume down. Keep going all the way down until it's off. Thank you very much. While your phone is out and in your hands, go ahead and open up your calendar app.
Oh, you're good.
Thanks. Our next High Noon speaker next month in September is actually going to be an actor portrayal of Nancy Russell, really exploring the unique story of Nancy and her really vital importance to the success of Charlie Russell's career, of her husband. So that's going to be a really fantastic event, and that will be next month as our High Noon, third Thursday of the month. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, well, unfortunately for you, fantastic for us, our last several walking tours of the season are currently sold out. But if you have 6 friends and are really have your heart set on taking a walking tour, gather up 6 of your friends and call us, because we will do specially scheduled walking tours. We just ask for a minimum of 7 people. So now that we have all of that out of the way, our speaker today is Steve Friesen, who we were actually just counting, I have known for over a decade. When I first started my professional career in museums west of the Mississippi, Steve and his lovely partner, Mona Lee, were some of the first people to say, hey, you know what, you should think bigger than a small rural museum in the middle of nowhere, which is where I was. And I said, okay. And then come to find out a few years later, here I am in the great big city of Billings. So it's been a really wonderful friendship that I count on. But Steve is really, I'm going to say, one of the foremost scholars of Buffalo Bill. He has forgotten more about Bill and the Wild West show and that history than I will probably ever know myself. Steve himself was born in Lawrence, Kansas, and attended Bethel College, where he received a BA in History and Social Sciences with a minor in Peace Studies. In 1975 and 76, he attended the Cooperstown Graduate Program, receiving an MA in American Folk Culture. He worked at a couple different museums in Colorado and Kansas and Pennsylvania, but then in 1995, he became the director of the Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave, just outside of Denver, Colorado, where he spent 22 years as the director there at the Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave. So he knows his stuff. He knows what he's talking about. Here in his retirement, it sounds like he's having a great time in retirement, but he can't really give up Buffalo Bill. And so he's continuing to do research, and he's continuing to write really cool stories and perspectives. So it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Steve for our presentation today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I've actually been to Billings a few times before, but never had an opportunity to talk with any of you folks, so I'm very pleased to be here. Let me make sure this thing's turned on. I had turned it off earlier. Lauren gave me a crash course on how to use it. So, yeah, it works, or at least I'm working it correctly. At any rate, just a little bit of a background on how I came up with this. How many of you remember the show, The Galloping Gourmet, on television? Yeah, see, I knew we were part of a similar demographic, at least some of us are. I used to love that show, and I'd go home after school and I'd watch it for a while. And I also was a real fan of Buffalo Bill. Little did I know that many years from those days, I would be actually doing research on Buffalo Bill and making connections between him and Graham Kerr's work. And in fact, I discovered that really Buffalo Bill was the first Galloping Gourmet. When I retired from the museum in 2017, I began 5 years of research on this book, Galloping Gourmet, Eating and Drinking with Buffalo Bill. I ran through hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles from the period, letters, other archival materials at the Buffalo Bill Museum grave where I was at. That's in gold in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody. Family papers at the American Heritage Center in Laramie. There's a nice collection there. Memoirs at the Beinecke Library in Yale, and a variety of places. The result was actually around 2,000 pages of notes, more than enough to write a book, all on that whole idea of eating and drinking with Buffalo Bill. But interestingly enough, it wasn't something anybody else had explored. So that really became of a fascination to me, that it was an unexplored topic. And of course, what any historian would love to do is to be the one who does the sort of the breakthrough research on a topic of that kind. So even though he wasn't ever called a Galloping Gourmet in his day, I decided to put that name to him, and I found out I could do that without getting sued by Graham Kerr for doing it as well. But at any rate, this aspect of him as a Galloping Gourmet, or a gourmet I should say, was well known at the time, and you found it in a number of the papers. Here's what the New York Sunday Tribune wrote about him in 1894. While you are at luncheon in the tent back of Colonel Cody's, you will get your first lesson, and a particularly delightful one. It is that Colonel Cody's table with the Wild West isn't Buffalo Bill's campfire in the plains or in the mountains. With Colonel Cody, you find you are in a jolly company at a lavish feast. And of course, he was sort of two personas in many ways. He was Colonel Cody as a businessman, a leader of industry, if you will. He was Buffalo Bill as a show business figure, same guy. Well, we don't particularly, as I say, associate Buffalo Bill with lavish feasting, but we expect to see him out on the plains, sitting around a campfire up here in the mountains of Montana or Wyoming. That was certainly how he got his start, but eventually he became a gourmet. So he became comfortable dining at Delmonico's in New York as he was sitting around a campfire chewing on a haunch of venison. He was born in LeClaire, Iowa on February 26, 1846. His earliest recollection of food was in a mishap he had in Iowa, where he stole some apples from trees in an orchard near his home. This young boy, this young Will, crawled over the fence, but as he was crawling over the fence, the guard dog for the orchard came running up and took hold of his trouser leg. So he's trying to get over the fence with the apples, and the dog's trying to keep it back down. Well, he managed to get over the fence with the apples, but he left behind his pants. So this is one of his early sort of encounters with food, if you will. Well, when he was 8 years old, his family moved to Weston, Missouri. And here you see this. It was a thriving town right along the Missouri River. It's 1854, and the plan of the Cody family is to move across later in 1854, when Kansas Territory is opened up to settlement. And it was there in Weston where young Cody looked and saw hundreds of wagons departing on the Oregon Trail for the great American West. And at that point, he told his family that's what he wanted to do. But he didn't do it right away. They were settled in Kansas near Fort Leavenworth, just very close to the Missouri River. And among the things that they ate were domestic poultry. At that time, people rarely referred to chickens by their breed, let's say Plymouth Rock or Leghorn, that kind of thing, but they instead talked about the colors of the chicken's legs. Yellow-legged chickens were particularly commonly raised in the United States in the 19th century. They were larger than the blue, black, or white-legged chickens, and they were more hardy. Now, in a little bit of research, I determined that these yellow-legged chickens were probably Dominique chickens, and here we see a picture of them. It's a breed introduced to America in the 18th century. They were very hardy, they had self-sufficient, they had a lot of plumage, a lot of feathers, so it was difficult for wild, let's say foxes or coyotes even, to get them. So they were well protected. Yellow-legged chickens were often served to company, and in that area, Particularly, they were served to circuit riding ministers. In fact, that practice was so common, people made jokes about ministers and yellow-legged chickens. Will's Cody his mother was a Methodist, so their home was often the destination for circuit riding ministers. His sister Helen later remembered that Will was not fond of sermons. I mean, what young boys are. And so he would go with their dog and try to scatter these yellow-legged chickens that they were raising back into the forest. And of course, that's what the chickens would do if they were feeling threatened. They'd go back in the forest and try and get into the trees. So he would chase them away in hopes that when the minister arrived, there would be no yellow-legged chicken for the minister to eat, and disappointed, he would go on to do his sermon at another house. That was the concept. After his father died of a fever, young Will became the breadwinner for the family, and at age 11, he got his first chance to take the Oregon Trail into the West. He drove wagons across the plains for Russell, Majors, and Waddell, who later started the Pony Express. Now, this is not the wagon train that we saw on television where you'd see all these settlers going across the Oregon Trail. These were teamsters with freight wagons taking supplies from the Missouri River in that area as things were coming up from New Orleans and elsewhere in the east, and they would take it across to Salt Lake and to points west, even as far away as Oregon and California. The teamsters were usually hard-drinking men, and they ignored the requirement that was maintained by Russell, Majors, and Waddell that nobody drink. That was one of those things. They said, well, you're not out here on the plains with us, we'll do what we want. And indeed they did, and that was Will's first introduction to whiskey. He also nearly starved on one of those trips. Will later recalled on one of the trips that they were stranded at Fort Bridger, which is on the west side of Wyoming. For the winter, food became so scarce that they even killed their mules for food. They were down to almost nothing. When spring came and they were finally able to go back east, they stopped in eastern Wyoming at Fort Laramie. He wrote, "Of course, we all had a square meal once more consisting of hardtack, bacon, coffee, and beans. I can honestly say that I thought it was the best meal I have ever eaten." Hardtack lasts so long without spoiling. There's still museums that have hardtack in their collections. This is actually some hardtack from the Civil War at one of the museums. That stuff lasts really, really long, and it was very hard, hence the name hardtack. So what you would do to make it easier to eat would you soak it in coffee. And the coffee would soften it up, and it had an added advantage. If there were any weevils in the bread, they would float to the surface. You could skim them off and throw them away and have your coffee and hardtack. I should point out, they also called it pilot bread, and they used it oftentimes on ships as well. I should point out, if you would like to try hardtack minus weevils, you can order it still on Amazon, should you have any interest in that. Over the following years, Will Cody acquired his nickname of Buffalo Bill as a buffalo hunter, then went on to establish a reputation as a scout. During that time, he ate food made for him by the various Army cooks and survived on rations as necessary. One of the things that was fortunate for him, since he was a scout, he could leave the forts and go out and hunt for meat, both for himself, and sometimes he would supply meat for the fort as well. He supplemented his scouting income with other industries, including opening a tavern near Fort Hays. That enterprise ended, however, when the commander of the fort confiscated his entire supply of alcohol because he was operating an unlicensed tavern. What is one of the neat things about that is Fort Hays in their records have a list of all the alcohol that they confiscated from him. So I had that kind of evidence as I was putting my book together on specifically what he was selling and drinking at the time. In 1871, 25-year-old Will Cody was introduced to his first gourmet dining, if you will. It was on a hunt with General Sheridan and some wealthy New York businessmen, and they had moved come west, hoping to hunt for buffalo. So what they did, and it was not unusual, they brought their own cooks, and they had a special tent, and they had a very nice tent set up for dining, and they had their own cooks preparing the wild game, though, with a variety of accessories that made them more gourmet-like, let's say. They were not just food, they were gourmet food. That first of those feasts that he had with Sheridan and those gentlemen consisted of buffalo tail soup, broiled Cisco and fried dace. Those are both fish that could be caught in the plains rivers at the time. Salad of prairie dog, that's the least appealing to me, I think, of those. Stewed rabbit, filet of buffalo aux champignons. See, he's learning French as part of this too. Buffalo filet with mushrooms, champignon. Roasted elk, antelope, black-tailed deer and wild turkey, broiled teal and mallard, those are ducks, and antelope, sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, green peas. For dessert, they had tapioca pudding. The drinks were champagne frappe, champagne au naturel, claret, whiskey, brandy, and Bass ale. I think they still make Bass ale in England. So I don't know if you can get that on Amazon as well as hardtack. You can check into that. When Buffalo Bill later accompanied a buffalo hunt with Grand Duke Alexis of Russia, he was introduced to an even more luxurious dining. There was a large tent where they actually laid down carpet or rugs inside it, so it'd have a rugged surface, and they had champagne and foods shipped from Chicago, as well as eating the wild game. And in this particular picture, this is Alexis shooting his first buffalo, and that's Buffalo Bill behind him with two feathers in his hair. After that hunt, which happened in early 1872, Buffalo Bill had been invited by those wealthy New Yorkers to go back to New York City. So he took the train for his first trip east, going to New York City in 1872 with those folks to visit those people. Now in New York City, his host took him to fancy balls, teas, and dining experiences. These would become regular events for him over the course of his life. He's introduced to Delmonico's, where he first ate, that's his first time eating there, and later attended a banquet where the cost per diner was nearly $100 each. Today, that would be over $2,000 per person. So it was a pretty good banquet. In 1872, as part of that trip, he was introduced to show business, and his life was never the same. He started out doing stage plays, performing sort of melodramas for 10 years. During that time, he lived out of hotels, which in many cases were usually offering the finest dining in any of the communities or the cities that he would have visited. In Hartford, Connecticut, he stayed at the Allen House, where he enjoyed oyster fritters, sauteed kidneys in port sauce, and leg of mutton in caper sauce. He also had oysters at the Hannes Oyster House, which was one of Mark Twain's favorite eating places. When he got to New York City, he stayed at the Sturdivant House. That was where he frequently stayed during those early years when he was with the stage plays. This is an envelope dating to the date that he stayed there. You can get a little bit of an image of the way the building looked. The hotel's restaurant was famous for its specialty, which was broiled pig's feet a la P.T. Barnum, because they were Barnum's favorite. And he was there for 2 weeks, so I'm sure he had that at least once, maybe more. Now, if any of you are interested in that recipe, the P.T. Barnum recipe, it's in my book, Galloping Gourmet, with 30 other recipes in the appendix. And those are for sale here at the bookstore. While it may not be popular today to be eating pig's feet, one of the items listed within a large order of food supplies later, the purchase for Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1894, was an entire barrel of pig's feet. So it was popular, perhaps more popular for them than for us. With the creation of Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1883, the nature of Buffalo Bill's dining changed again. He continued to dine in hotels when the show stayed at major cities, but for the most of the time, he dined with the show, with his employees. But he didn't give up fine dining. Instead, he shared it with his employees. One reporter noted that they received just as good meals as the high roller at a first-class hotel. That was no small order. The show started out with around 400 persons on staff, but over the years that number swelled so that by 1910, I think that's when he came to visit here, incidentally, and I'll get to that later, there were 1,600 persons with the show. So imagine you're supplying breakfast, lunch, and dinner to 1,600 people. You can see this large tent. There's the arena, that's the arena, and there's these sort of spectator tents where they can watch from. Certainly the horses' stables are pretty good size. This is the dining tent. That's really quite large. Here we see a 4th of July meal. There's Cody in the front. This is one of those unguarded moments when he didn't have his hat and people noticed he was losing his hair. So you can see, though, every table's covered with tablecloths and set with napkins, silverware, china of various kinds. Now, that was 4th of July, but they served them that way every meal. And they not only had fine sort of china that they ate on, they also were served by waiters. Let's see if we can see one. Yeah, there's a white-clad waiter there. So he would go and he would take everybody's order and bring in the food. And in those days, steak was really important to them, actually. It was possible to have steak for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that's a really good Western fare there, I think. This is a 4th of July menu from another occasion. It was a very important holiday for the Wild West, both for patriotic and nostalgic reasons. The show was always on the road during the summer, so it was not a time, a holiday you could spend with family or friends. You were spending it with your show business family and friends. So Buffalo Bill made a point of having a special banquet every 4th of July for his people. This is a souvenir menu that they had when they were in Lille, France. And on the last you see coffee and tea, which you would expect to finish off the meal, but we know who provided the coffee and tea. It was the Mirt Company in Lille, France. And that company, it was so important to them that they did that for Buffalo Bill at the time, that they have created a sort of a souvenir or a commemorative tea, a black tea, which is Buffalo Bill tea. So when you go to France, if you could get to Lille, France, this is, quite frankly, I've tried tea various places in Europe as well as in England. This is the best tea. It's really good. So make sure to get to Lille, France if you're into tea. If you're not, you can just stick with that Starbucks stuff. Okay, here's some images of the cooks at work. The staff was served plenty of food, a lot, good food, as I said, and plenty of it. Annie Oakley, who joined the show in 1885, remarked that breakfast consisted of good coffee, bread, butter, preserves, fine steaks broiled over wood coals with fruits and berries in season. Beef was a staple, as I already mentioned, on the Wild West menu, and it was consumed in all of its forms. They had pork, lamb, chicken, and fish. All were served and eaten at various times. But again, beef was central. One visitor reported that, quote, a dozen cattle, quartered and ready to cut into stews, roast, and soup bones are piled up together looking like a mountain of meat, and it represents but one day's meat allowance. That's a lot of beef. In 1894, the amount of beef needed to feed all the members of the Wild West during 1 week was 5,694 pounds. Everything was cooked in large quantities. There were 1 yard square sized meat pies, 350 tarts as big as your hand, they said. And for breakfast, 110 quarts of coffee and 125 quarts of tea. They had 150 pounds of bacon at each breakfast and 120 dozen eggs. So there's some serious eating going on. And so these are the guys that made it happen. So up on the top, you see some people starting to cook those steaks. Here are some folks working on some soups. See the large kettles there. This is the serving staff. Here's another view of the cooks. Now they're standing in something very special. It was called a range wagon. That was the term that they used. It was described as a monster range on wheels, or, quote, an altar of gastronomic hopes. I think a lot of us wouldn't mind worshiping at that kind of altar. The range wagon was 20 feet long. Once it was rolled off the railroad car and taken by a team of 8 horses to the showgrounds, it was positioned in the center of a half acre where they did all the cooking. The sides were lifted up, propped up like that, and they had as many as 6 to 8 cooks doing the work all around the side, cooking for all those folks. Again, you're looking at close to 1,600 people eating here. The area was very interesting to visitors, though, and they had to fence it off with ropes because visitors were fascinated by what was going on. And I do have a few items here, some flat artifacts, photos, and documents. And there's one picture there in France, and people are standing around watching them cooking. Now, while the operations behind the scenes of the Wild West are important, people were really coming to see the show itself. They wanted to see the American West and all of its stories, just what they've been reading about in the dime novels and the newspapers. So it was the American West that was the central theme of the story and of the show, but they eventually added more to it. It's kind of like going for nearly 30 years. You got to add things a little bit, change it up so people will keep coming. And what Buffalo Bill did was he added something referred to as, let's see where it is, a Congress of Rough Riders of the World. And here you see not only cowboys, but Irish Lancers, Arab riders. There's a Cossack there, Vaqueros. Vaqueros were the show from the beginning. Another kind of maybe Scottish Lancer. And then you have a Gaucho from South America, another Lancer. Sometimes they had French Lancers, and then of course, always the American Indians who were central to the show. This, as somebody reported, as great school of anthropology with all these different peoples would eat together in the tent. And that was a special challenge, in fact, for some of the cooks who had to come up with special foods for each of them. This one here is a picture, it's some time off, and you can see they're playing actually a game of rounds. It involved betting and some things like that. So you see Indians, Cossacks, Gauchos. There's a Cossack, there's a Gaucho. There's a Cossack with his back to us, some cowboys in there. All of the vaqueros as well. So one of the things that was remarkable to people at the time, and in many ways we could even say it's remarkable to us today, was that they all ate, worked, and played together, and they got along together. And at one point, it was even noted that it's too bad that the rest of the world doesn't do the way they do it here. Get along, all these different peoples getting along in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Now, one of the things that was rather unique, and certainly one of the first that Buffalo Bill introduced, was Mexican food. He had the vaqueros as part of his show, and a couple of the wives of the vaqueros, when they were in New York City in 1886 at Madison Square Garden, they opened up a Mexican cafe. And it was possible then to go eat Mexican food. And I think this is the first time that most people in New York might have even seen it. In fact, one of the reporters wrote about it, the food there, and said that it was unrecognizable to the taste of the average New Yorker, at least those that weren't traveled. He was unimpressed with the repast for the most part, though. He noted that the tortillas taste for all the world as the paste-soaked circus poster must taste to the ravenous goat. So it's also kind of interesting the florid, flowery way that they were writing. He was also unimpressed by and we know this is not that, henchilada, H-E-N, enchilada. He wrote that it was something that looked like a rolled French pancake, but was, quote, a very different thing indeed. And certainly if it's spiced the way they often are, you could see it might have been a bit of a surprise for him. Now, regarding the mezcal, you guys know what mezcal is? It's related to tequila. It's processed a little differently, and it's quite frankly, a little stronger than tequila. But with the mezcal, he wrote, it was a combination of the flavors of gin, rum, and rhubarb. And he said, this is the quote, "In repeated doses, it is said to have the power of all the other intoxicants combined. No man can toy with it with impunity." Well, that Mexican cafe was the first, and I think it's the last time Buffalo Bill's Wild West tried to create an ethnic food concession. I'm not sure how well it went over with the New Yorkers initially, but there is one thing in there, and you see the tamales. And they did like the chocolates, but the tamales, a few years later, apparently that introduction helped them become quite popular. And just within 8 years, there were tamale parties being held in New York City. Tamale stands were selling tamales as well. So that was the first culinary offering of Mexican food in New York City. And in fact, probably the first Mexican restaurant opened in 1886 east of the Mississippi. From all I can find, that's the very first Mexican restaurant east of the Mississippi. So it was one of the firsts. Not too many people know about that, as they don't know about many of the things about Buffalo Bill. So one of the things, as I mentioned, was a real challenge to the show's cooks to come up with foods that would satisfy everybody. And some of them they did cook them to order. The Indians loved steaks, lots of steaks, had no interest in vegetables. You served them a vegetable, they'd send it back. The Cossacks loved pickled foods, so they got pickled meat 3 times a week. The Sinhalese, which we see here, they're natives of Sri Lanka, I think we call it today. They drank only water, no tea or coffee, and they preferred food heavily spiced with pepper and plenty of rice. The Arabs ate unleavened bread, baked specially for them on certain days of the week. So the cooks had to kind of do this with all of those up to 1,600 people. They had some special diets to deal with as well. Now, there was one special diet that was enjoyed by the American Indians only once a year, but they always loved it, and they felt it was good luck to have it, and they had it just once per season, and that was they would have a dog feast. So it was celebrated as a holiday, and it was a break from their ordinary diet. It was done quite openly, and that's, well, for example, even that photo, it's here in a Harper's Weekly, I think it is. Has a picture of them cooking their dog feast. The reporters reported on it, but they were kind of disgusted by it at the same time, as my wife is, particularly. She loves dogs. But anyway, even if they didn't care for the dog feast, the reporters and the press were invited to the show for special meals, and those they enjoyed, particularly the Western meals. They were often meals that featured what they called rib roasts, and the rib roast of beef usually were roasted by the American Indians over an open fire, big, huge roast, and they would cut it into chunks. And so the press or dignitaries would be seated on benches, and they would bring them a stick sharpened on 2 ends. One end would be driven into the ground, and the other end would have a hunk of beef impaled on it. And they'd say, "Eat up." It was like a beef lollipop. And that's what they would eat, and the way they would eat it. And if they wanted more, they shoved the steak back on in the ground, and they'd give them more. Otherwise, you held onto the steak if you're full already. But they found this to be most unusual, and they were quite fascinated by the Western meal. Have any of you had a Western meal like that? I don't think I ever have. I think it was completely an invention by the marketing guys at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. But it was fascinating, and invariably the press would write about it. Well, you might recognize this guy. Thomas Edison did a lot of work, a lot of business with Buffalo Bill. It was a relationship that began when Buffalo Bill hosted him during the Exposition Universelle in Paris. That was in 1889. That exposition is when they opened up the Eiffel Tower. And both Buffalo Bill and Thomas Edison were among the first to go up the Eiffel Tower. But he threw a brunch. Buffalo Bill threw a brunch for Thomas Edison. It included clam chowder, sole, quail on toast, steak with mushrooms, chicken, corn, hominy, biscuits, cornbread, and baked potatoes. Dessert was pumpkin pie, apple pie, mince pie, watermelons, pears, peaches, grapes, peanuts, and popcorn. Edison later said it was one of the high points of his visit to Paris. Now, with all this talk of food, how many of you ate before you came here? Well, I didn't either, so I'm looking forward to this being over so we can all eat then. But at any rate, he had a chance to meet with very important people. And one of the persons that he met with while he was in Europe was Oscar Wilde. He had tea with Oscar Wilde, but he dined with the Prince and Princess of Wales, hosted them at his show, and served them. They served them the same food as they served all the employees, because it was some of the best food being cooked at the time. The British Prime Minister joined them. Crown Prince Wilhelm, who later became the Kaiser from Germany, was there. Other celebrities. He was invited to many banquets and parties. He joined English actor Henry Irving. You may not have heard of him, but you've heard of his good friend, Bram Stoker. What did Bram Stoker do? Dracula, the writer of Dracula. He got to know Buffalo Bill pretty well, and actually had some characters in some of his writings kind of loosely based on Buffalo Bill. During his lifetime, he dined with other famous people. He dined with James McNeill Whistler. That name ring a bell? Buffalo Bill was going to be painted by Whistler, but I think he decided to paint his mother instead. And so Buffalo Bill was never painted by Whistler. Rosa Bonheur, a very famous artist at the time. Of course, Frederick Remington, Albert Bierstadt, they also dined with him. When he was in Washington, he lunched with presidents like President Grant. After a meal with Cody, Theodore Roosevelt said, quote, "Buffalo Bill has always been a great friend of mine." And indeed, Roosevelt was very much supported by Buffalo Bill in his efforts, particularly to the saving of natural spaces. As his Buffalo Bill persona became one of the best known figures of his time, William F. Cody, the businessman, became an, what's the word we use today, influencer? He became an influencer. His opinions on current issues were sought out and could be read in the newspapers. He was able to speak out about things that mattered to him, like preserving natural areas, as I mentioned earlier, conservation of the buffalo. Yes, he got his name, Buffalo Bill, as a hunter, but he always hunted for meat. He wasn't part of the devastation of the herds, and he was as concerned as anybody else was about that. He spoke out for women's rights. Women having the right to vote. Didn't they just celebrate the anniversary of that this last week? Women getting the right to vote. He was 100% in favor of that, and also that women should be paid equally to men and have equal opportunities. He spoke out for Indians' rights, said they had a right to be who they were, to practice their religion, to do their dances and everything else. And when they were in Washington, he typically took some of his Indians to meet with presidents and with other dignitaries and plead their cause. So the dinner table, as well as the printed page, often became a forum where he could trade ideas with the influential people of his time. Now, in addition to this rather ingenious range wagon that I showed you and opening the first Mexican restaurant in New York City, Cody also introduced other food innovations on his trips to Europe. Here we see a map of the 1887 American exhibition. That was in honor, as in London, in honor of the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. So here is the exhibition here, and there was a little bridge, and you could walk over and see Buffalo Bill's Wild West. In fact, at the time, that Buffalo Bill's Wild West was so popular, people said it actually eclipsed the rest of the exposition. It was extremely popular. And along this side here, see that arc? Along that back, let's go here, was something, here's a close-up from a different map. That was at the time the largest bar in the world. It was 700 feet long and was said to be the largest, as I say, in the world. They imported American bartenders to provide the drinks. There were supposedly 400 different kinds of cocktails served. And this is kind of interesting because they did not drink cocktails in Europe. They didn't drink it in England. This was the introduction of the American cocktail to the people of England. One of the drinks, I have to just telling Kevin this, one of the drinks that they served was something called a corpse reviver. If you want to try a corpse reviver, go over to the Northern, what is it, the 10, the lounge at the 10, and they serve corpse revivers there. So maybe after all of this talk, you can revive yourself with a corpse reviver. So you can imagine with 400 different drinks, they're having a hard time coming up with plenty of good names for them. But anyway, this was a very interesting, important introduction. They did not use cocktails in Europe up until that time. And at that time, they started building or adding American bars to different hotels. They called them American bars where you could get cocktails. This is the American bar at the Savoy Hotel in London. It's still in operation. It's the longest running American bar in Europe. They make corpse revivers there. I had one when I was there 2 years ago. So, popcorn was a very popular concession of Buffalo Bill's Wild West in America. So when he went to Europe, they offered popcorn. People weren't eating popcorn in Europe either, but they sold them at their popular concession stands. And if you'll see, this is an illustration. Again, this is from England, American popcorn. Not just popcorn, American popcorn. When it came to France, newspapers reported, quote, "Buffalo Bill is teaching Paris to eat popcorn." After the show left Paris, popcorn continued to be sold at concession stands at Parisian theaters. And one theater critic complained. He said, "This popcorn has gotten so popular, everybody's eating it, and I can't hear the dialogue." So it was popcorn, the American cocktails, rib roasts, and other foods shared with the show's European hosts in Cody's Western meals that helped introduce America, as well as all the other aspects of the show, to the people in Europe. Now, Buffalo Bill's Wild West made 2 extended trips to Europe, from 1887 to 1892 and 1902 to 1906. 2 years after returning from Europe, in 1906, Cody found that there were a lot of other Wild West shows going. And one of his competitors was a guy named Pawnee Bill. In fact, Pawnee Bill had learned to do Wild West shows as one of Buffalo Bill's employees and then went off on his own. Well, they combined their show and became, as you can see, Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Pawnee Bill's Far East. And in 1910, August 30, 1910, that show came to Billings. The Billings Gazette reported that the show was erected near the country club. Is there more than one country club here by now? Well, there was one then. And they went to the country club and they did their show. 10,000 people turned out. Actually, 10,000 people turned out at each show, one matinee and one evening show. So you had 20,000 people coming to Billings, as well as the people who were here to see Buffalo Bill. There were 1,000 Cody residents who came up by a specially chartered train. He also, and we were just looking in the gift shop here at the Northern Hotel, the photo of the Northern Hotel, and it had a balcony on it. That's the one Kevin told me burned, and now they have the current Northern Hotel. But Cody held kind of a reception, just like you see in the photo, which was done for the Crown Prince of Norway. So Buffalo Bill was out there and did a reception at the Northern, talking with everybody, meeting them as he could, and that kind of thing. The newspaper reported also that there were 1,100 men and women with the show at that time, and from 27 different nations. He had people from every continent except Antarctica, which was only populated by penguins. So the Gazette wrote, "It was like a homecoming. This is the country that knows him and has claimed him. This is the territory over which he scouted and for which he fought not so many years ago." That was their tribute to Buffalo Bill's visit in Billings. And this particular act, Cowboys and Indians playing football, was also one of the acts when they were here in Billings. Now, before I conclude, I need to talk a little bit about Buffalo Bill's drinking, because there's all sorts of exaggerated things about him and alcohol. His connection, his relationship with alcohol was as complicated as his relationship with his wife. And I'm not going to get into that, because that would be a whole nother lecture. But at any rate, that is dealt with also in the book. Now, as I already mentioned, he probably learned to drink alcohol, particularly whiskey, during early trips across the plains as a wagon driver. For the next 2 decades or so, he was very much like other frontiersmen who were pretty much hard drinkers. This continued into his years as a scout, when on one occasion the cook at Fort McPherson sent him and a fellow scout into North Platte, Nebraska to get supplies. Instead of food, the two came back with a 5-gallon demijohn of brandy, 2 cases of Old Tomcat gin, and an undisclosed amount of whiskey, and no food. The cook was very angry, but they shared the whiskey with the fort's commanders and officers, and all was forgiven. Now, I mentioned the Old Tom gin. That was a very popular kind of gin. Here you can see Old Tom gin, and it was called that because they frequently had a tomcat on the labels and on the advertising. That Burnett gin, Old Tom gin from Burnett's, was very probably what he bought. That was very popular at the time. Well, he continued to drink as he entered show business, and on at least one occasion was accused of being drunk during one of his plays. That happened very infrequently, but when he started the Wild West show itself, 10 years after he'd been on stage, his partner was Nate Salisbury, who absolutely insisted that he refrain from drinking during the show season. And Cody agreed. So, for the next 30 years, for 7 months of each year, he did not drink any alcohol. When the season was over, he did go back to drinking, insisting it was for recreation, and it enabled him to, quote, throw off thoughts of work and labor for the time being. I think there's probably a few people that gather at that bar at the Northern for that purpose as well. But based on my sources, I've concluded that yes, he was a social drinker, but you got to consider he didn't drink at all for 7 months of 30 years. So he enjoyed alcohol in its various kinds, particularly whiskey, but he was in control of it, not the other way around. He was a drinker, but he was not a drunk. But as he got older, as the years went by, Cody drank with greater and greater moderation when he wasn't with the show either. In 1904, he wrote to a close friend that he only drank alcoholic beverages 3 times after 1901. Then in 1905, he had a personal spiritual awakening. Excuse me just a moment. This is water. I think I've got to cough for just a moment. I get a little dry. So, he had this personal spiritual awakening. He wrote his sister he decided to stop drinking entirely. So he took up ginger ale. You can drink a lot of ginger ale and never get drunk. Well, I swallowed wrong too. After a few years, his health began to deteriorate after his 70th birthday. Well, also his appetite deteriorated as well. This is the last photograph of him, taken at Glenwood Springs, and he's very gaunt in that picture. He was on his way to Denver, and he died just a couple of days later in Denver on January 10, 1917. He was just a month short of his 71st birthday. Well, Buffalo Bill passed on, but his legacy is so large in so many ways, and his food legacy is part of that. There are steak restaurants named after him in France. There are bars in Zimbabwe and Brazil and in Croatia named Buffalo Bill Bar. There's restaurants like Denver's Buckhorn Exchange. Buckhorn Exchange is one of the oldest restaurants, the oldest liquor license from 1893 in Denver. It's still operating. Buffalo Bill, after his death, was buried on Lookout Mountain, June 3rd, 1917. His foster son, Johnny Baker, was a marksman with the show and also worked as one of its managers. On Memorial Day 1921, he opened Pahaska Teepee on Lookout Mountain, offering dining, a gift shop, and a museum. And his interest in dining had developed under the tutelage of Buffalo Bill while he was with the show. In 1979, a different museum building was erected for the museum, and was to house the museum portion of it, and that was the place where I worked. The cafe, gift shop, and the museum still operate up there. This is my favorite painting of Buffalo Bill. In it, we see a man who not only scouted the Great Plains, as literally a scout, but also looked forward and influenced the future. He scouted the future, if you will. His legacy is large, as I mentioned. He influenced everything, not only from food, show business, rodeo, Western movies, and again, foodways. So next time, as you enjoy a nice meal at your favorite restaurant, think about Buffalo Bill and raise a glass to America's first Galloping Gourmet, Buffalo Bill. Thank you. And then also, that's the book. They are being sold here. It's $24.95 plus tax, I believe, right?
No tax.
That's right. Oh, you guys. Good for you. Anyway, buy more books. It's for the gift shop. Anyway, any questions or comments? Yeah.
You mentioned that they eat a lot of beef. Did they eat buffalo too then?
At the very beginning, he did some of those rib roasts with buffaloes, but by 1883 is when he started the show, and by 1883, the buffalo herds have been very much decimated. There was a certain point in the 1880s, close to 1890, that Buffalo Bill, his own private herd that he maintained for his show, was one of the largest herds of buffalo left in the United States. And so he wasn't about to kill those beasts who were very central to his show and central to his heart in many ways. And he was among, as I mentioned earlier, among the early people to say, this can't keep happening. We have to stop killing the buffalo in these numbers, and they need to be preserved. He was very interested in preserving natural areas as well. He took a very early visit to the Grand Canyon, looking at the possibility of turning it into a national preserve. That didn't happen for years. He also supported Teddy Roosevelt's efforts to create Yellowstone National Park and other work. Gifford Pinchot, if you've heard his name, his efforts to preserve and create national forests. Buffalo Bill was 100% supportive of that too. So it's a long answer to that one question, but I got to get on those licks, because Buffalo Bills sometimes get dissed by people who don't really understand him or understand the history. Yes?
What is the connection with the Irma Hotel restaurant to Buffalo Bill?
Okay, so Cody itself was created by George Beck, who was a good friend, well, and Buffalo Bill and a couple of other people. So they created the town of Cody. And that, I get into some detail with that in the book. But the bottom line was Cody decided that he would like to help develop that whole area around the town of Cody. And he started out by building the Irma Hotel in the town of Cody, as well as several other places, Pahascatipi, outside on the, just outside the border of Yellowstone National Park. You have the TE Ranch. So he invested a lot of money in a future for Cody, Wyoming. And that's why it's named Irma. His youngest daughter was named Irma.
They do still serve oyster stew at the Irma. It's disgusting.
Well, oyster stew, well, I've had mountain oysters there too. And some people find that disgusting. I think it pairs very nicely with Wyoming whiskey. But anyway, yeah, oyster stew is perhaps an acquired taste if you're not from the East. And I don't think I'd ever do Rocky Mountain oyster stew. That just sounds wrong. That just sounds right wrong. Yeah.
I guess I have more of a comment, but Alfred Heimer, who was one of the curators for Buffalo Bill's show, came to Billings after he retired, and he opened the Rex up, which was a popular. Now it's the Buffalo Dock or something.
Yes, I forgot all about that. That's in the book too. That, yeah, he was one of, that's how you know?
No, I do walking tour down there.
You do walking tour. Yeah, I included that. The Rex. Yes. Oh, yeah. Now, there were a number of posers. And when you have a famous person, particularly they have no way of checking up on people and finding if they were who they claimed to be. There were guys that claimed to be Buffalo Bill that weren't. There were guys that claimed to be on Buffalo Bill's show that weren't. And as I was doing my research, I found a number of people that claimed that they were Buffalo Bill's personal cook. Heim or Heim? I'm trying to remember. Heimer. He was.
Okay.
He was Buffalo Bill's. No, he was the real thing.
Okay.
He's one of them that made the cut. There's a few of the others I say, nah, they were just posers. But he's one. Yeah, I forgot all about that this is where he opened the Rex then. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, well, if we're through with questions, if you want to ask any questions of me privately afterwards, I'll be available. And I'll be happy, if you buy any of those books, I'll be happy to sign them for you. So thank you again.